it turned out that this weasel was only known from skins. So it was
Mm.
collected. It was known to science. Someone had probably shot it back in the 1800s and skinned it, and there was a skin sitting in a museum. But no one had ever photographed it. No one had ever seen it alive. And this was the Colombian weasel, and his photos of it, which are these important scientific relic now, they're sitting on his toilet inside that cabin. So those are the official Colombian weasel photos.
My name is Eva Cornman, and I'm an educator here at the Museum of Science. Today I sat down with Scott Loarie, Executive Director of iNaturalist, a platform that's turning millions of people into one of the most powerful conservation forces on the planet. We talked about how even just a single photo can transform what scientists know about our natural world. Thank you so much for being here today. Really looking forward to speaking with you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I kind of just want to start out by learning about this thing that you made. So in 2011, you started what the New York Times once called the nicest place online. And I'm talking about iNaturalist. So for those who are not familiar, what exactly is iNaturalist and how did it come about?
Yeah, so iNaturalist is an app where you go outside and you can point it at any living thing, take a picture of it. And that's how a lot of people get into iNaturalist. Like, what's this butterfly? What's this salamander?
Mhm.
Take a photo of it and it'll identify it. But then what's special, and I think makes iNaturalist different, is you post it, you share it with a global community of naturalists and scientists who will help identify it and turn it into research quality data for science. So everybody can be empowered to not just learn about the world around them, but actually collect real data for science and conservation.
Mm.
In terms of how it started, you have to go even further back than me. So iNaturalist started as a master's project at UC Berkeley by Kenichi Ueda. And I was a grad student at the time, and I just thought, this is amazing. This was right at the time when things like Instagram and came out, and people had, there was a novelty to have, the ability to capture a photo on your phone. And I just thought, this is amazing. And it really, I do think, helped unlock citizen science, because what iNaturalist allows you to do is to distribute the task of observing and identifying nature, which means that in the past, it was very hard. It had to be a group like birds that was relatively easy or well-known for people to really tap into and scale biodiversity knowledge and collection. But now we might have someone say, oh, this is just a cool bug. And then someone else says, oh, it's this beetle. So it's a collaboration across the social network.
You mentioned the term citizen science. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so really it's just public participation in science. So how do you get everyday people to actually contribute to the scientific process? And I'm a huge, some people call it community science.
Okay.
I'm a big community science, citizen science advocate, because it really is a win-win. I mean, you can do science at scales that just aren't possible. There just aren't enough scientists out there to actually collect data like you can if you can crowdsource across huge groups of people. And I also think the activity for the public to really participate in that thrill of discovery and scientific process is just really special. And it's just, that's what gets me going. It's like, wow, there's something new here. I'm actually contributing to something that we didn't even know about before.
Yeah.
And that thrill is what got me into science. And it's so cool to be able to package that up and give that as an experience to anybody who wants to participate.
So I'm hoping you could kind of briefly walk me through what using iNaturalist, what using the app actually entails and what it looks like for a regular user.
Yeah, and like I said, most of the general public, it's a species identification app. And it is true that this increasingly now Siri and Google Lens can do that, but we were the first group that had, when we started, there wasn't even any sort of computer vision or AI. So you would take a picture of a butterfly, post it, and someone else online would say, that's a monarch or that's a swallowtail.
Yeah.
But then we were the first group to actually have a computer vision model that had thousands of species. We launched it with 2,000 species, and we're constantly updating it. So every month we add about 1,000 or 2,000 more species. And now this model can identify about 100,000 species, which is really cool. But it's really, it's not like AI competing with the community. It's the synthesis of all this expertise in the community, just trying to make it more accessible in real time to the community. So I'd say that's how the general public experiences iNat is like, oh my God, my dog has a snake. Is it poisonous? Take a picture of it. But what we hope is that that's just sort of a gateway. And then people realizing like, wow, actually, wherever I go, I can start really looking at and understanding and sort of almost like collecting. Museums back in the day would go out and like Darwin would go out and collect species. You can do that anywhere you go. Like if you go on vacation, just like, and the app will tell you these are the kind of fun, almost like Pokemon, the fun things around you. And this is great. This is rare. And then so that's the second step. And then the third step is, if you share this, post it, with the global community that will vet it and turn it into data, you really can contribute to science. And it's fun, too, to get the social aspect of it. Be like, oh, all of a sudden I'm interacting with, maybe I posted something and someone else is telling me like, this is something rare, this is something important. And that pollination across the social network is really, really cool.
Yeah, yeah. So give me a sense of the scope of iNaturalist. How many species have been documented? Why is this important?
Yeah, so today, iNaturalist, we have millions of users. We have about 7 million users a month. And this community has created hundreds of millions of observations. I think we're at like 300 million observations. But what's really cool is it's 25% of every species on the planet. So this is something that, we've been struggling to do as scientists for centuries, is how do we actually document this planet that we share with at least 2 million named species. There's probably many more than that. And we haven't been able to quickly census life. And iNaturalist has been able, just on the backs of people taking photos, get a quarter of all species. And I'm really excited about that as a scientist.
Yeah.
Were you referring to here in Massachusetts as well?
No, just in general.
Oh, yeah.
But I guess also here in Massachusetts, I'd be intrigued.
Yeah, I mean, so the last year in Massachusetts was about 700,000 observations, so just under a million, and about 5,000 species, which is pretty impressive. I mean, to put that in perspective, there's about 10,000 species of birds globally. But most of the tree of life isn't things like birds or mammals, it's insects and plants. So in a place like Massachusetts, to get 5,000 species, you're really tapping into insects and plants and these little known trees, branches of the tree of life where we just don't know a lot. So every photograph can be really important.
Wow. I was wondering if you could share some of your favorite stories of observations that people have made. I heard on your TED Talk a little hint of something called the hashtag toilet weasel.
Yeah. Well, so that was a great story, which was this guy was down in Colombia, and his name was Juan, and he was camping in like a cabin. So it was like a windowless frame cabin it had windows but no glass. And this weasel jumped into the window.
Okay.
So he started taking photographs of it and posted them to iNaturalist. And it turned out that this weasel was only known from skins. So it was collected. It was known to science. Someone had probably shot it back in the 1800s and skinned it. And there was a skin sitting in a museum. But no one had ever photographed it. No one had ever seen it alive. And this was the Colombian weasel. And his photos of it, which are these important scientific relic now, they're sitting on his toilet inside that cabin. So those are the official Colombian weasel photos. And that happens all the time. I was actually looking. There's 130,000 species like that, where they appear in the scientific record as a specimen, usually collected, Darwin style back on a ship. And then they just go completely silent for like 150 years. And now we're seeing them appear on iNaturalist, which is really cool because you just think, we have this initial sort of, these things appeared on the radar as like a blip and then went silent, and now they're blipping again. So those are really cool. But the most kind of charismatic and exciting things we have are brand new species. When someone sees something and scientists look at it and go, whoa, this is really weird. And those are really exciting. We get those about once a month.
Wow.
And they tend to be like, there was one recently where a woman was in Big Bend National Park and saw this plant and posted it, and this is a really weird plant. It was a very beautiful and woolly plant, but small. And it was a completely new species of plant. And what I like about that one is that was inside of a national park in the United States. So you'd think of all the places where you'd think we would have a handle on biodiversity would be inside a national park. And I think that just shows how little we know and how important every one of these observations can be to science and conservation.
I'm curious your thoughts on how iNaturalist and other citizen science platforms are kind of transforming how we catalog biodiversity.
The other big one that has to be mentioned is what the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is doing mostly with birds. They have the eBird platform, which is amazing. And birders are so insane. I mean, and that was one of the things that really inspired me with iNaturalist is how do we replicate what's happening with birds with some of these other groups of taxa? But I didn't realize this, but birds are 0.05% of the tree of life, very small slice, but 80% of what we know about the natural world in terms of number of records are birds, which is just this testament to bird watchers being so productive and crazy and insane. And then I don't know if you guys probably heard of Merlin recently, which is Cornell put out this app where you could actually listen for bird songs. And that just has opened up bird watching to the general public. Because if you think about it, bird watching, you still have to be kind of an expert. You have to know the bird and, oh, that's a wren, that's a robin. But now people can just whip out their phones and identify species just from the sound.
Yeah.
So I'd say in the biodiversity citizen science realm, there's eBird and Cornell are doing amazing things. And then iNaturalist, we're just trying to flesh out the rest of the tree of life and compete with these crazy birders. We call them birders gone bad when you have a bird watcher and we can kind of hook them, be like, hey, salamander, because birders are often in these amazing places and
Yeah.
they're looking up in the trees, but they'll be walking by incredible things. And if we can just get them to, hey, take out your phone and take a picture of that mushroom,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a huge contribution.
Over 5,000 scientific publications have come from the data set that's been created through iNaturalist, from literally just photos that people took. And it almost seems like iNaturalist is maybe starting to change some of the ways that scientists are studying biodiversity. Give me a sense of just how important iNaturalist and the data that's been created because of it is to the scientific community.
Yeah, I think that our unique niche with iNaturalist is just filling in data on, like I mentioned, all these branches of the tree of life where we know so little. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of data on groups like birds or elephants or rhinos or some of the big charismatic fauna. But a statistic I think is pretty amazing is there's this thing called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility that all museums publish their data to.
Hmm.
And in the last decade, most data for most species has come from iNaturalist,
Wow.
which is pretty crazy. So most of the data is actually bird data, but on all of these obscure plants and insects from around the world, that data is coming from the iNaturalist app just because people are paying attention. And I think that's pretty cool. And again, what I love about citizen science is that it connects people and involves the public. But even if you're just looking at on the merits of the scientific contribution, that's amazing. It's amazing that most of what we know about most species is just coming through this app, which
Hmm.
is pretty cool. And a lot of those studies are kind of single observation studies, like we talked about the toilet weasel and things like that. But a lot of them are these studies that involve thousands of observations.
Mm.
And that's what for me is really exciting is when got going on this, biodiversity was still like you'd open a drawer and maybe there'd be like 6 samples.
Yeah.
But now, we really can start thinking about biodiversity data as big data, and you start using big data analysis tools, models, even
Mm.
AI to analyze that. And that's where I think some of the really exciting research is coming out, where scientists are saying, let's look at, there was a paper recently where scientists looked at like thousands and thousands of Portuguese man o' war photos in iNaturalist and used image recognition algorithms and actually show that there's multiple species. They look slightly different and they have
Mm.
different biogeographies. And that was only made possible by big data, big analysis approaches looking at thousands and thousands of photos.
Any significant actionable changes that have come out of, studies or data from iNaturalist in terms of like action towards conserving biodiversity?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the best examples is the early detection of invasive species.
Okay.
So I can say this because we're in Boston, but one that was all over the news last year was in 2024 was the Joro spider. I'm sure you guys have
Okay.
heard of this. So it's this big, scary looking spider from Asia that came over in like the 90s and was established in Atlanta. And then it's been slowly marching north.
Mm.
And when these observations get posted to iNaturalist, we actually have an AI model that looks for and flags unusual sightings.
Okay.
And the first observation of Joro spider in Boston came through iNaturalist.
Wow.
And what's really interesting is that was in 2024. And in 2025, there haven't been any Massachusetts Joro spider observations on iNaturalist. And
Okay.
I think that's what's neat too, is when you have enough data, you don't only know where species are, but you also have a pretty good sense of where they're not. I
Mm.
mean, there's definitely detectability and bias issues, but given how much attention the community was looking at Joro spiders in the Boston area in 2024, it'd be very unlikely for them to have been overlooked this year. And that's interesting too, because these invasive species, once they get established, they're really disruptive. There's an
Mm.
estimate that like billions of dollars a year are spent dealing with invasive species like zebra mussels. But if you can catch them early, then you can get rid of them before they're established. So I think of it almost like a forest fire. Like, do you guys have spotted lanternflies up here?
We unfortunately do.
Yeah.
Yes.
So well established here. You're not going to get rid of them, but those are throwing sparks. And almost once a month on iNaturalist, there's a spotted lanternfly will show up somewhere where they're not established,
Mm.
and then immediately the Department of Food and Agriculture or something will act on that data. And who knows if this is just beating back an inevitable tide, but it still is how I think we're going to deal with invasive species moving forward. We just have to early action on these outbreaks before they become established.
So literally just taking a picture of a weird bug in your yard could like help protect native species in your home.
Yeah, and there's other examples so those invasive species are spreading out, but there are a lot of another thing that comes out of iNaturalist from a conservation aspect is where when you get an understanding of, wow, these are actually just a couple populations. When you have just a few observations, you don't really know where something is.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have hundreds of millions like we have, you go like, wow, this plant is only here, here, and here.
Mm.
And these ones are protected, but this one isn't protected. So we've also seen examples of iNaturalists of communities rallying around pieces of land and being like, going to their local city councils and being like, look, this is a really important piece of land. It's the only, we have evidence now that this is the only place that this plant grows or something like that. So that's really cool to me too, that when you have this connected, engaged community, you have data, and you put those together, that's the foundation for grassroots conservation action. And the third way is we have a lot of groups that are doing stewardship activities. So they'll come together and say, maybe we're going to use iNaturalist to monitor this park, but we're even going to go a step further from monitoring and act on that data. So say, okay, this is really interesting. We don't have any amphibians here. Why is that? Well, maybe we need to restore our wetland. And then by restoring the wetland, maybe they can attract amphibians, and then the monitoring will show that they're there. So it's a sort of combined grassroots monitoring and protecting and improving habitat. One of my quickly favorite examples of this is this group out in California, not far from where I am. And there are these salamanders that cross roads and get hit by cars when they cross the roads.
Okay.
So there's this whole community of people that they go out and monitor this and look for the places where the amphibians are getting really hit by roads crossing.
Yeah.
And they help them cross. But then they also are working to put in undercrossings. They look like cattle guards so that the amphibians can cross safely.
Wow.
So again, it's like an engaged community that I hope we're helping create. There's data knowing where these species are most at risk, but then there's community action, actually reducing the threats. So for me, that's just this recipe for the environmental movement for biodiversity. We need engaged people, we need data to make good decisions, and we need the ability for small groups of local people to make local improvements to habitats. And that's what I hope we're doing.
So I was actually hoping you kind of speak more on the community aspect of doing citizen science. Why is doing science together so important in your mind?
Yeah, and what I like about it is iNaturalist is a big tent, and we have lots of different people who are doing it. I'd say it runs the professional gamut from big scientists, important scientists, to young people who are just getting started. It also runs I call it the tech spectrum. You have the sort of the Luddite naturalist who you have to really convince them to even take their phone outside when they're outside, to this sort of technology people are like, wow, we're going to solve problems with technology, trying to bridge that gap. I also am really proud that we've bridged the political divide. I mean, so many things are polarized now, and I still feel like coming together around nature is one of the few things that people can actually come together around.
I'm curious the importance of doing citizen science around biodiversity right now. Like, what is the state of biodiversity on our planet? What's happening to biodiversity on our planet? And how can the kinds of information that you get from iNaturalist be helpful in protecting it?
Yeah, and that's where the story is kind of grim. I mean, so most of the projections are that we're going to lose up to 1/3 of all species this century, which is insane. I mean, you think about 1 in 3 species, and that's because of ongoing land use change, which is something species have always faced. But now we have this climate change on top of it, so it's sort of a double threat. And a lot of the things that we need to do to reduce the threats from climate change are land use intensive. So you think about switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy. That's going to take big wind farms and big solar panel farms, renewing our grid. So species are at a really precarious time now where the unit of currency is land. And we need to figure out how, in a piece of land, to feed ourselves, to do all of our energy needs, and preserve these 2 million species that we share the planet with, 2 million named species. So it's sort of a real crunch time for species. But that's where I'm optimistic that if what we need to do to preserve species, first we need to care. Even if we knew exactly what to do and no one cared, nothing would happen. But if we have this engaged grassroots group of people who care, that's going to be the engine that we need to do something. Then we need to know what to do. And that's where this data really plays an important role through things like scientific papers and things like that. But then the thing that I'm actually most excited about is this grassroots action like we were talking about, and the community action. You were asking earlier about communities. And I think of I can go for a run by myself. I can go out I take a photo with my iPhone, post it to iNaturalist by myself. But sometimes I might want to participate in like a 10K run with my community, or even do a marathon or something. And that's where I think a lot of the social fabric that you were talking about comes in. iNaturalist, we have these things called BioBlitzes.
Okay.
So BioBlitz are people kind of coming together in real life to a particular place at, in person, and saying, okay, we're all here at this park. Let's all see how many species we can document together. And so it's a social activity,
Mm.
and it's not for everyone, but I think for a lot of people, that social aspect of it is what makes it exciting. And what I'm really excited about is that's where we see that kind of really cool coming together of communities, data, and decision making. Where
Mm.
people will be like, yeah, we all are here. We love this park, and we're noticing that we don't have any native pollinators. What can we do about this as a community? So I really think that the community aspect of bottom-up conservation is really important to me. I've always felt that the environmental movement is too top-down,
Mm.
which is just very disempowering when you're like, the government's supposed to fix this and they're not doing anything. And if we can rebuild the environmental movement so that the action comes from the ground up, but then we can use technology. All technology is a tool to stitch these things together so you can see the context and say like, wow, it's not just me protecting something in my yard, but there's millions of people around the world doing this together.
Mm.
And that's really important to me. It's just trying to rebuild the environmental movement from the bottom up. And I think that will make it much more effective.
It's interesting you mentioned your backyard, because something that I think about a lot is it can often feel really difficult to have this sense of connection with nature and, all of the marvelous biodiversity when maybe you live in a place where the most biodiversity you're going to see is like a squirrel in your yard or,
Mhm.
some Kentucky bluegrass. But with iNaturalist, it seems that the squirrel in your yard becomes very valuable. I'm wondering if you can kind of speak on the ways in which citizen science and apps like iNaturalist are helping to connect people with nature, even the nature that might be as seemingly mundane as a squirrel in your yard.
Every observation really does count. There's actually, you mentioned squirrels, and there's a couple species of squirrel that are uh, they're not necessarily invasive, but they're expanding out and they're showing up in different cities.
Mm-hmm.
And the official maps that scientists use are not keeping up because
Okay.
these squirrels maybe have moved into different cities. And I think that's an example of a pretty interesting scientific study that was just based on, as you're saying, sort of the most mundane thing you can imagine, which is
Yeah.
a squirrel in your yard. And there's also cities are a really important um, kind of place for where there's a lot of really unique questions of urban biodiversity. So there's a scientist named Greg Pauly in Los Angeles, and one of the things he studies is like, what species do you lose in a city? So like, for example, what's really weird is you lose the big snakes, and that's because the snakes are eating fairly large mammals, which you lose. So like looking at a city and seeing like, what do you lose is actually a really interesting and important area of science. And then the flip side of that is these invasive species that I was talking about. A lot of them first show up in the city.
Mm.
So in Los Angeles, they've lost a lot of the big native reptiles and amphibians, but they have this whole new assemblage of reptiles and amphibians that are invasive that are coming from somewhere else that are
Mhm.
like released pets. So this whole area of urban biodiversity is actually a pretty active and interesting area of science where those observations from the middle of cities are actually really valuable.
Can you say more on how iNaturalist is helping people feel connected to nature and why feeling connected to nature is important when we think about the future of biodiversity?
First of all, I think that nature is beautiful and incredible, and we're hardwired as humans to care about it.
Yeah.
We evolved. Think about it, being a human in the world, like your survival depended on knowing literally thousands of plants, what was edible, what wasn't. I think we just have this innate affinity for the natural world, and what's really sad is how disconnected we're becoming.
Mhm.
People are kind of increasingly cut off from it and inside. But what's good about that is once people start connecting to it, that you know that innate ability kind of turns on. I call it iNaturalist eyes.
Okay.
You see a lot of people go to a golf course and they're like, "Oh, this is so beautiful." It's nice and manicured, and then they'll look at the swamp behind the golf course and be like, "Oh, that's horrible." But then once you have these sort of natural history eyes, you kind of look at the golf course and you're like, "Okay, not a lot here." It's very manicured. There's no interesting plants, there's no interesting insects. And then you look at the swamp and you see the dragonflies, the amphibians, you hear the sounds, and you start just connecting with nature in a different way. And I think that's great. It's a wonderful gift, I think, just to be able to understand the ecosystem and
Mhm.
know about it. But I also think that's what makes people care, because that's when people are going to go, well, wait a minute, that swamp is actually kind of useful and sort of important. We should protect that. So I'm really excited about these sort of iNaturalist eyes where you're connected to and seeing the natural areas as being the foundation for actually standing up and saying, we actually, as a community, value this thing and need to protect it.
I think something that's also really interesting here is not only the feeling of being disconnected from nature, but there's also often maybe a sense of feeling disconnected from science. This idea that science is just for scientists, documenting biodiversity might involve having a PhD and a bunch of really fancy gadgets. But
Yeah.
that's not the case with iNaturalist at all. I mean, the case here is that everyone can make meaningful contributions to science. Why is that important in your mind?
Yeah. Well, I think especially as you mentioned today, where there's so much risk of disinformation and people being misled. And I mean, at its core, science is observation and just this whole idea about what is true, what's critical thinking. And as you say, is completely separate from the conservation mission. Just getting the public familiar with critical thinking and how do you assert this is an observation and how do we check that and test it and put that in context is I think really important for having an informed public.
Yeah.
So that's another, I think, a really important aspect of citizen science is just trying to come up with an informed citizenry that can navigate this crazy time we're living in where no one really knows what's true.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important.
Can you tell me more about some of these BioBlitzes? And I'm also curious about the City Nature Challenge, which started with science museums. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. The City Nature Challenge has sort of turned into iNaturalist's annual big day,
Okay.
but we didn't start it. It was totally organic. So it started as a friendly competition between, as you mentioned, two science museums. One was in San Francisco and one was in LA.
Okay.
And they said, let's hold BioBlitzes on the same day. And it would be kind of fun. And there's sort of an LA, San Francisco rivalry. And then the next year, a couple more science museums did it at the same time.
Mhm.
And before we knew it, a couple of years later, there were literally hundreds of cities that were doing this on the same day. And this last year in 2025, I think it was almost 1,000 cities.
Wow.
So there's the same weekend in April. But the statistic that I still kind of can't really believe is that on this one weekend, just these cities, these 1,000 or so cities participating, they were able to monitor and census 1 in 20 of all species on the planet, which is crazy to think about because that's all species on the planet. That's deep sea fish. That's like little gnats. That's, little mice that live on the top of some tropical mountain. 1 in 20 of all species on the planet.
That's nuts.
Just checking in from 1,000 science museums saying, let's hold BioBlitzes.
That is ridiculous.
Yeah. And it makes you realize like, wow, this is within reach. I mean, biodiversity has always been kind of the black sheep.
Mhm.
We're like, okay, we can monitor crop yields and we can monitor water quality and maybe carbon, but like biodiversity, there's no way we're going to do that. It's just like millions of species, each one with its own role in the ecosystem and biology.
Yeah.
But now you're like, we really can. 2 million species is not that many. And imagine this infrastructure to really have the pulse of these species checking in. And then the idea that we can do that just on the backs of science museums, getting people out with their phones is pretty exciting.
Yeah. I mean, like, to get a sense of this, how long would it take a lab or a big group of just scientists with their gadgets to do something like this? Like, would it ever be feasible in a lifetime?
No.
No.
I ran one statistic once, which was like, if someone was making an observation every second for like 24 hours a day or something, it would take thousands of years.
Mm.
And it really is a testament to what we can do together.
Yeah.
You can do so much more when people work together than any person can do alone.
I'm kind of curious about your own science journey, your interest in science, how you became interested in the natural world. Were you always interested in the natural world, or is it more of a recent passion?
No, I always was. I mean, I grew up on a river in Northern California. And I
Okay.
think that was what got me interested in nature. And one thing that was interesting is that river was really beat down. And then I knew it well as a kid. And then when I came back when I was at a late high school and college and starting to get interested in the sciences and realized that like bald eagles came back,
Mm.
steelhead came back. There was this little frog called the foothill yellow-legged frog that came back. And all that was just kind of just people stopping doing the horrible things that were happening in the 70s. Like let's not throw all our pesticides into this river or let's not put dams up right when the steelhead.
Mhm.
And it just made me realize like there are little things we can do to act, and these ecosystems will respond to it. So I always in college, I was like obsessed with nature. I went into ecology because I thought that was the way to stay close to nature.
Mhm.
But I kind of ended up like a lot of the grant funding pulls you into energy and things I wasn't that
Mm.
interested in. And I was kind of on the fence. And I was in the Bay Area at the time, and there was just so much happening with technology. And that's when I met Kenichi Ueda, who had just launched iNaturalist as his master's project. And I was like, this is so cool. Like this is guys, everything that's cool about what's happening in the Bay Area with tech. It's so close to what I love, but I kind of didn't think it would. I just thought it would be a fun thing to try, and
Yeah.
it's been over 15 years since still working on it.
Wow.
But it's again, iNaturalist is. I'm very fortunate to be sort of getting to sit here and talk about it, but it really is a community, and that's one of the things I'm most proud of. Is iNaturalist. It really is just this amazing community of millions of people. Some people are just so invested in this thing, and it's just an honor to have the privilege to work on something like this.
I mean, yeah, what's it been like to see iNaturalist just explode in the way that it has? Like, would you and your collaborators have ever expected that when you were just getting started?
I mean, it has been a long time, and
Yeah.
it's other people are like, "Oh, this new app," and it's like we've been around for like 15
Okay.
years, but it's been this incredible slow climb. But what's cool is it's one of those things where I think people look at it now, they're like, "This thing is huge. How did that happen?" And it was just a slow,
Mm.
steady march. But what I'm just looking forward. I feel like we're just getting started. I mean,
Mm.
there's so much that we could do to try to get people engaged, really try to build this machine that could census all of life annually and coordinate this grassroots conservation movement that we need. And we don't have a lot of time. I mean, we really need to do this by like 2030 to meet all of these 30 by 30 goals that have been set. So this is just such an incredible time to be working on this project. And I just want to keep working.
I mean, what are some of the next steps in your mind to reach these, goals by 2030?
So one is just trying to make the app more accessible so we can get more people into this. A lot of people probably won't get deeply involved, but we just
Mhm.
want to expose to more people because we know that the champions, the champions for nature of the future are out there. We just have to reach them.
Mm.
I'm really excited about going from monitoring to stewardship. We were saying, you just look at the community and there's so many amazing on the ground projects that are doing things. And I think with iNaturalist, we're not orchestrating this, but what we can do is kind of help take those champions, make their jobs easier and model that to the rest of the community.
Mm.
And I'm really excited, like we were mentioning with City Nature Challenge, where you could say, wow, this one weekend we had 1,000 cities census 1 in 20 species. What if you said 1,000 species measurably improved habitat for tens of thousands of species? Like,
Mm.
I think we're close to being able to do that.
Something you had mentioned was the little things we can do. And I think it's often really easy to kind of feel hopeless about the future of science, of nature, of our planet. And it can also feel really difficult to sense that any action you might individually take is actually going to make a difference. You've said before that it starts with noticing nature. So what are some of the little things that we can do? What are some of these first steps that we can take to feel like we really are making a difference?
Just can't emphasize the first step is to literally just go outside. It could be a sidewalk and take a photo but post it. A lot of people don't get it off their phone
Yeah.
because what's I think really starts getting that aha moment is when someone else will engage with the observation, and all of a sudden, like I mentioned, that thrill of discovery. I mean, so many things. People are like, well, this is really weird. This doesn't happen this time of year, or this is further north than we've seen this, or this
Mm.
is earlier. This is something that's kind of rare, and having that sort of communal engagement over an observation, I think, is what gets a lot of people to realize, oh, this isn't just a plant identification app. It's
Mm.
actually a communal effort to understand and document the natural world. So I would encourage, it starts with noticing, but post it, because I think that's where hopefully not everybody. I'm sure a lot of people will just want to. I'm just knowing that this is a snake is good enough, but
Yeah.
where people who I hope will move further down this journey, you are uniquely positioned just by where you are, where and when you are, to really fill a gap.
Mm.
And then, but I would encourage you to take a good photo. Some people sort of take a photo of a bug across the room, and it's, I think what any of the more experienced naturalists or scientists want are good photos.
Okay.
So I often take a lot of photos. If I see something that I'm like, this could be kind of exciting, I don't really know about this, I'll turn it over and take 3 or 4 photos all in the same observation.
Okay.
So that's definitely something I would encourage.
Can you take videos or is it just pictures?
You can't take video.
Okay.
That's something we want to do. You can take sound. So you can record sound. And there are a lot of people who will identify things like cicadas and singing insects and birds based on those audio recordings.
I guess I am curious, like, what does it feel like to, you said almost every month there's an entirely new species that's been posted on iNaturalist. Like, what does that feel like, just discovering new species all the time, both for you on the back end of things, but have you ever talked to the people who have, posted these new species? Like, what is that experience like?
Well, what's cool, I mean, unfortunately, there's a bit of a lag because for things to be described, they normally have to go through a process.
Yeah.
But generally what happens is some person posts something to a naturalist and doesn't know, and then some scientist sees it. Or sometimes there's a middleman. So someone who's like the grasshopper kind of connector.
Okay.
And is like, I better loop in these guys because this looks really weird. And then the scientist gets looped in, and then they go, oh, and sometimes it goes offline onto email.
Yeah.
And then there's this process of writing a paper. But then once the paper's published, usually that gets commented back onto the observation. And just that, as you mentioned, talking to the people who posted, it's like, wow, who would have thought that this thing that I saw is a totally new species? And I had this happen maybe once. I took this photo of a little roly-poly, those little roly-polies, and I posted it, and a scientist contacted me and said, that's definitely a new species. Can you send me a specimen? And I've gone back to this place like 4 times looking for this thing, and I can't find it again. So my new species story is not quite finished yet.
Okay. Well, hopefully there's an ending to it at some point. Because
I'll keep you posted.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.